The jungle does not forget. It grows over the stones, its roots curling like possessive fingers around forgotten faces. It swallows plazas whole, drinks down pyramids, and whispers secrets in a language of rustling leaves and dripping rain. But sometimes the earth gives up a ghost. In the sweltering lowlands of southern Mexico, along muddy riverbanks, lie the silent, staggering remains of a world that should not exist. Here, staring out from the green gloom with a calm, immense authority, are heads. Not just carvings, but colossal portraits in stone, some weighing 24 tons or more, wearing helmets, their features broad and unmistakable, their expressions caught between sorrow and terrible power. They were found buried, as if intentionally laid to rest by their own people, or perhaps by time itself. Who were these giants? Who carved their likeness from volcanic mountains and dragged them 60 miles through swamp and forest without the wheel, without pack animals? This is not the story of the Maya or the Aztec, but of the ones who came before, the ones who laid the first stones of civilization in the Americas. Their name is lost to us. We call them Olmec. This is the story of the mother culture, the jaguar's children, the makers of the first American mystery. Our story does not begin with a grand excavation, but with a perplexed farmer. For centuries, the local people of the Mexican states of Veracruz and Tabasco lived among strange, humped hills that felt too symmetrical to be natural. They plowed fields and found shattered pieces of polished jade and serpentine. Most famously, they encountered the colossal heads. The first official report came in 1862, when a traveler named Jose Melgar y Serrano visited a hacienda near the village of Tres Zapotes. There, half buried in the earth, he saw a gigantic head of basalt stone. He was stunned, not just by its size, but by its features. He described it as having Ethiopian characteristics, an observation that would unfortunately launch 1,000 wild theories about lost tribes from Africa or Atlantis. The truth was far more revolutionary and, in its own way, more profound. This was not a visitor from across the ocean. This was a Native American masterpiece, and it was impossibly old. For decades, these finds were considered oddities, anomalies with no place in the known history of the continent. The mighty Maya of Yucatan were seen as the region's first geniuses. The Olmecs were ghosts without a name. That changed in the 1930s and 1940s, thanks to the relentless work of archaeologists like Matthew Stirling. Stirling led expeditions into the heart of the Olmec territory, a region the Aztecs would later call the Almen, the land of rubber. With machetes and sheer determination, his team cleared the jungle from mounds at sites like La Venta and San Lorenzo. What they uncovered rewrote the textbook. They found not just the colossal heads, but vast ceremonial centers, intricate mosaics buried deep under courtyards, stunning figurines, and altars depicting rulers emerging from caves holding rope-like motifs that symbolized authority. Crucially, they discovered dates in the mysterious long-count calendar, a system everyone believed was invented by the Maya. But these Olmec dates were older, much older. The stunning, inescapable conclusion began to dawn. This was not a side chapter. This was the prologue. The world they revealed was one of shocking sophistication and deep, palpable mystery. The Olmec heartland was not a land of generous abundance. It was a watery, challenging world of tropical rainforests, swamps, and mighty rivers like the Coatzacoalcos. There were no large stone quarries here. To build their civilization, the Olmecs had to master their environment with a fierce intelligence. They built their cities on immense artificial plateaus of raised earth to escape the seasonal floods. They carved their monumental art from stone that came from far away, from the Tuxtla Mountains, a rugged volcanic range dozens of miles distant. Imagine the feat, carving a multi-ton head with stone tools, then transporting it without wheels or beasts of burden across rivers and through marshes. The current best theory suggests they used huge log rollers and rafts, moving these monuments during the rainy season when waterways were high. It was an act of staggering communal effort, a statement of power that echoed through the silent forest. But why? What compelled them to undertake such a backbreaking task? The answer lies not in the engineering, but in the art. For the Olmecs spoke in symbols, and their language was written in jade and basalt. Every colossal head is a portrait of a specific ruler, a divine king. The helmets they wear are likely protective gear for the ritual ballgame, a sacred sport that symbolized the cosmic struggle between life and death. These heads were eternal monuments to living gods, meant to watch over their people forever, their sheer size making the authority of the ruler as immutable and permanent as the stone itself. They were the anchors of Olmec identity, giant faces of power staring out from the very land they commanded. But to understand the depth of their world, we must look beyond the heads, into the spiritual realm of the were-jaguar, the rain god, and the sacred portal between worlds. To walk into an Olmec ceremonial center was to step into a living, breathing model of the universe. The cities were not haphazard collections of buildings. They were precise cosmic diagrams laid out in clay and stone. At La Venta, a narrow island ridge in a sea of swamp, the Olmecs sculpted the very earth into a sacred mountain. They built the first great pyramid in Mesoamerica, a fluted cone that may have represented a volcano, a mountain of creation, or the primordial mound from which all life emerged. This massive structure, over 100 feet high, was not built of stone, but of nearly 3 million basket loads of carefully selected clay, each basket carried by a devoted hand. It was an act of faith made physical, a mountain born from collective will. The alignment of the site was deliberate and charged with meaning. The central ceremonial complex was laid out on a north-south axis, slightly off true north, possibly aligned with a significant star or celestial event. Along this axis, the Olmec priests and rulers staged the drama of existence. Here, they placed massive offerings, not in temples, but deep in the earth itself. They dug pits down to the water table, into the damp, dark realm of the underworld. Into these pits, they carefully laid pavements of brilliantly colored serpentine blocks, forming intricate mosaics. One such mosaic, nearly 15 feet across, depicts the snarling face of a jaguar or perhaps a dragon-like creature. After this sacred pattern was completed, it was not displayed. It was immediately buried under layers of colored clay, sealed away from human eyes. This act is the key to the Olmec mind. The power was not in the display, but in the offering itself, a gift to the forces that lived beneath the world, an anchoring of cosmic energy in a specific hallowed place. The ruler, the man portrayed in the colossal heads, was the linchpin between these worlds. He was not just a political leader. He was a shaman king, a being who could traverse the layers of reality. In the damp Olmec lowlands, the most powerful natural force was not the sun, but the rain and the terrifying, transformative storm. And the embodiment of the storm was the jaguar. The jaguar was the apex predator of the American rainforest, a creature of immense power that hunted both on the ground and in the trees, that was at home in the night. The Olmecs saw it as a master of all realms, earth, water, and the underworld. Their most pervasive and haunting art form is the transformation of human and jaguar features into a new, supernatural being. This is the were-jaguar, a baby with a snarling, downturned mouth, a cleft head, and almond-shaped, slitted eyes. It is a visage of both life and terrifying power, often depicted crying, symbolizing the life-giving rain. This were-jaguar motif is everywhere. It appears on delicate pendants of rare blue jade held close to a ruler's heart. It is carved into massive stone altars where a ruler holding a were-jaguar infant emerges from a cave, the womb of the earth. The message is clear. The ruler's lineage and his divine right to rule come directly from this primal, chthonic force. His authority is born from the union of the human and the supernatural, the jaguar's stormy might made manifest in a dynastic line. The cleft in the infant's head may represent the furrow in a maize field, tying this divine power directly to fertility and sustenance. Every aspect of Olmec life was infused with this spiritual electricity. Even their playful-looking figurines, with their pudgy, infantile bodies and helmets, may represent shamanic avatars or ancestors, their eyes often upturned in ecstatic communion with the unseen. But how did this complex belief system, this intricate web of symbols, come to be? The Olmecs did not emerge from a vacuum. The roots of their civilization are buried deep in the pre-ceramic past, in the simple farming villages that dotted the region centuries before the first colossal head was carved. The catalyst for their explosive cultural development likely lay in a combination of environmental mastery and a revolutionary idea: the concept of the divine king. As these early villages grew successful, perhaps through the cultivation of maize and the rich aquatic resources of the rivers, a social hierarchy began to crystallize. One individual or one lineage claimed a special connection to the forces that controlled rain, maize, and life itself. This claim was legitimized through ritual, through the control of exotic trade goods like jade and obsidian, and finally, through monumental art that made the claim undeniable. The colossal head was the ultimate proof. Only a being touched by the gods could command the labor to create such a thing. Thus, the Olmec vision was born, a vision that saw the universe as a layered, interactive drama with the shaman king at its center, mediating between the people and the jaguar's whisper from the spirit world. This vision would become the foundational template, the mother culture DNA, for every civilization that followed in Mesoamerica. But to spread this vision, they needed more than symbols. They needed a network of influence that stretched across mountains and into distant valleys, a network built on the most coveted stone, jade. In the Olmec world, the most precious substance was not gold nor silver. It was a stone the color of still water, of new leaves, of the deepest sea, jade. To the Olmecs, this brilliant green stone, known scientifically as jadeite, was far more than an ornament. It was living earth, crystallized energy, the very essence of life, fertility, and breath. They called it the stone of the heavens, and its possession and transformation defined their elite, fueling a trade network so vast and sophisticated it formed the first economic and cultural web of the Americas. The quest for jade was a driving force of Olmec civilization. But here lies a profound mystery. There are no known sources of high-quality jadeite in the Olmec heartland. The closest major sources are in the Motagua River Valley of modern-day Guatemala, a rugged, mountainous region over 600 miles away. Across this immense distance, through some of the most difficult terrain on the continent, the Olmecs orchestrated a flow of raw stone. They did not use pack animals. There were no carts. This was a relay of human endurance. Porters, likely part of a specialized merchant class or diplomatic embassies, would have carried heavy loads of raw jade cobbles across jungle trails, over high mountain passes, and along river routes. The value of the material was so high that its transport was worth years of effort. Once this precious rough stone arrived in the heartland cities like La Venta or San Lorenzo, it was placed in the hands of master craftsmen. Using string saws with water and abrasive sand, delicate drills made of hollow bone or reed, and hours upon hours of patient polishing with increasingly fine grits, these artisans transformed the stone. They created objects of breathtaking beauty and spiritual power. There were concave mirrors made from polished magnetite or ilmenite, often set into ceremonial costumes to flash like sudden lightning during rituals. But the jade work was supreme. They carved exquisite pectorals, chest ornaments, in the form of the were-jaguar, its fangs and cleft head rendered in miniature perfection. They made polished celts or axe heads that were never meant to cut wood. These were symbols of lightning, of the divine axe that splits the sky to bring rain. In lavish royal burials, the deceased was covered in a regalia of jade. Beads by the hundreds, ear spools, masks, and figurines placed in the hands and over the face. The green stone was a conduit to the afterlife, a physical piece of the living world's vitality that would accompany the soul into the realm of the ancestors. This obsession with jade was not just local. It was the glue of an empire of ideas. The Olmecs established colonies and trading outposts far beyond their swampy homeland. At sites like Chalcatzingo, far to the west in the highlands of Morelos, Olmec-style carvings appear on living rock faces, showing rulers seated in throne-like caves, surrounded by Olmec iconography. In the distant Pacific coast region of what is now Guatemala, at sites like Tacalica, Olmec motifs appear alongside early Mayan developments. These were not necessarily conquests by military force, but rather the spreading of a prestige culture. Local chieftains, seeing the power and sophistication of the Olmec shaman kings, would have sought to emulate them. They would have traded for Olmec goods, welcomed Olmec artisans or priests, and adopted the symbols of this potent New World order. By controlling the supply of exotic, ritually charged goods like jade, obsidian for sharp ritual blades, and iridescent feathers from quetzal birds, the Olmec heartland positioned itself as the spiritual and economic hub of a widening world. This network reveals the Olmecs not as isolated jungle dwellers, but as the first great integrators of Mesoamerica. They were the catalysts, the ones who first articulated a language of power and the sacred that everyone else could understand. They created a kit of civilization, the ceremonial center with its pyramid and plaza, the concept of the divine king, the ballgame, the worship of a rain earth jaguar deity complex, and the use of precious green stone as a sacred medium. This kit was adaptable. Highland peoples, coastal peoples, nascent Mayan peoples, all could take these ideas and remix them for their own environments and needs. The Olmecs provided the foundational grammar, and for centuries that grammar was spoken across the land. But no civilization, no matter how brilliantly it shines, lasts forever. And at the very peak of Olmec influence in their greatest city, the first dark cracks began to show. The story of their decline begins not with an invasion from outside, but with a quiet, terrible violence from within, written in broken stone and buried secrets in the red soil of San Lorenzo. The city of San Lorenzo sits on a vast, artificial plateau rising dramatically from the swampy plains, a feat of labor that reshaped the very horizon. For centuries, it was the beating heart of the Olmec world, the first great capital. Its rulers, their faces immortalized in at least 10 of the colossal heads, commanded the network of trade and ideology. The plateau thrummed with activity. Artisans polished jade, priests prepared for ceremonies, and the Grand Plaza staged the sacred dramas that maintained cosmic order. Then, around 900 BC, something catastrophic happened. The city did not fade slowly. It was violently, systematically, and symbolically murdered. The evidence is etched in stone, a silent testimony to a frenzy of iconoclasm. Archaeologists working at San Lorenzo made a grim and puzzling discovery. Nearly every major monument at the site had been deliberately mutilated. The colossal heads, those supreme symbols of royal authority, were viciously attacked. Their faces were gouged, their features smashed, but they were not destroyed completely. They were then carefully, almost ceremoniously, buried in long, straight lines like bodies laid to rest in mass graves. Altars depicting rulers were defaced. Monuments were toppled and broken. This was not the random looting of invaders. This was a precise, ritualized decommissioning. It was a revolution etched in basalt. Who did this and why? The leading theory points not to an outside enemy, but to a bloody internal uprising. The people of San Lorenzo itself may have risen against their rulers. Consider the immense social cost of the Olmec system. The sheer human energy required to build the plateau, to haul the multi-ton stones from distant mountains, to sustain the elite classes. This burden would have fallen on the backs of the common people. For generations, they may have accepted this load, believing in the divine contract. Their labor in exchange for the rulers guaranteed harmony with the gods, bringing rain and fertile maize. But what if the contract broke? A series of poor harvests, a devastating flood, or a prolonged drought could shatter the illusion of the king's power. If the ruler could no longer bring the rains, was he still a god? Or was he merely a man who had demanded too much? The defacement of the monuments is key. In Mesoamerican thought, a sculpture was not just a representation of a king. It was a vessel for his essence, his Chulul, or soul force. To mutilate the image was to ritually kill the king's power, both in the present and for all eternity. Burying the heads was not an act of disposal, but of containment. They were neutering the symbols, putting them to sleep in the earth, the realm of the ancestors and the dead. This suggests a profound theological revolt. The people weren't rejecting the cosmos, they were trying to reset it. They were overthrowing the failed intermediaries, the royal lineage, perhaps to try to communicate with the jaguar gods and the rain spirits directly, or to install a new, more worthy lineage. After this violent purge, San Lorenzo was largely abandoned. The heart of Olmec power shifted east to the island sanctuary of La Venta. This move itself is telling. La Venta, surrounded by swamps, was more defensible, perhaps a conscious choice by a new, wary elite who had learned the terrible lesson of San Lorenzo. The art style changes, becoming even more elaborate and esoteric. The colossal heads at La Venta are more skillfully rendered, but the expressions seem more introspective, even weary, as if carrying the memory of the trauma at San Lorenzo. But the practice of ritual monument burial took on a new, deeper meaning at La Venta. It became a core part of their cosmology, not just an act of revolutionary violence. They began to stage elaborate burials of precious offerings, creating sacred time capsules. They would build intricate mosaics out of thousands of serpentine blocks on the ground, then cover them over, layer by layer, with different colors of clay, building a sort of artificial, layered mountain over the offering. This was a reenactment of creation, a sealing of sacred energy into the earth. The violence of San Lorenzo, the burial of broken kings, may have been transformed at La Venta into a more controlled, cyclical ritual of death and renewal, a way to manage the terrifying powers of both the natural world and the human heart. Yet, even this refined and spiritually fortified city could not escape the slow unraveling. The causes of the final Olmec decline were not a single event, but a creeping constellation of disasters that squeezed the life from their world, leaving their grand cities to be swallowed, one, by the waiting jungle. The great ceremony at La Venta would have been a spectacle of sound, color, and profound belief. The air thick with copal incense smoke, the beat of drums echoing from the earthen pyramids, priests in resplendent jade and feathers channeling the voices of ancestors. For centuries, this rhythm sustained the Olmec world. But then the rhythm faltered. The drums fell silent. The plazas emptied. The meticulous offerings ceased. By around 400 BC, La Venta was a ghost city, its monuments staring out at an advancing green wall of vines and roots. The Olmec heartland, once the pulsing core of Mesoamerica, was largely abandoned. This was not a sudden cataclysm like the violence at San Lorenzo, but a slow, grinding exodus. The people did not vanish. They walked away, leaving their sacred cities to the elements. Why? Modern science is beginning to read the environmental memoirs hidden in the very soil of the Olmec sites. The answers point to a world under immense, unsustainable pressure. The first and most profound threat was likely a changing climate. Studies of ancient pollen and sediment cores from the region reveal a troubling story. The centuries of Olmec flourishing coincided with a period of reliable, abundant rainfall. The swamps were full, the rivers navigable, the maize crops bountiful. But climate is not a constant. Evidence suggests a shift towards more unstable weather patterns, with periods of intense drought punctuated by catastrophic flooding. For a civilization built on water management and maize agriculture, this volatility was disastrous. A drought meant failing crops, famine, and a crisis of faith in the rain bringing shaman kings. A massive flood could wipe out the carefully raised fields and settlements in the low-lying river basins. The environment that had nurtured the Olmec genius was turning against them. This environmental stress would have ignited the second threat: social unrest and conflict. As resources dwindled, the delicate social contract shattered. The elite demand for tribute, food, labor, exotic goods for rituals, would have become an unbearable burden on a starving population. The common people who had once willingly hauled stones for the gods might now have refused or turned their tools against their rulers. Warfare, once perhaps ritualized and limited, may have become desperate and brutal. The trade networks that were the lifeblood of Olmec prestige began to fray. Outposts like Chalcatzingo show signs of increased fortification and violent destruction. The far-flung partners dealing with their own climate troubles may have stopped sending jade, obsidian, and other critical materials. The heartland, isolated and under siege from within and without, began to hollow out. There is also the silent, insidious killer of success: ecological degradation. The Olmecs were not passive inhabitants of the jungle. They were major landscape engineers. To build their cities and feed their people, they cleared vast tracts of forest for agriculture and for the clay to build their pyramids. This deforestation could have led to soil erosion, siltation of rivers, and a local drop in rainfall. They may have literally changed their own microclimate, making their homeland less habitable. The very scale of their civilization sowed the seeds of its decline. The abandonment was likely a gradual retreat, a migration in all directions. Families and whole communities packed what they could carry and left the ceremonial centers behind. They flowed into the highlands, along the coast, and deeper into the forests, merging with other groups, taking their knowledge and beliefs with them. This is why the Olmecs did not disappear. Their bloodlines and their ideas became threads woven into the fabric of countless successor cultures. The people became the Maya, the Zapotec, the peoples of the rising city of Teotihuacan in central Mexico. The Olmec world ended not with a bang, but with a diaspora. For centuries thereafter, the great cities of the heartland slept. Jaguars padded across the overgrown plazas. Trees grew through the cracks in the altars. The colossal heads slowly sank into the mud, only their stone crowns visible like drowning giants. The memory of the makers faded into legend, preserved only in vague stories among later peoples about a time of giants or a place of origin called Tamunchin. The Olmecs had returned their cities to the earth, completing a cycle they themselves would have understood. From the sacred mountain back to the jungle. They became ghosts, their name lost, their presence felt only in the strange, powerful objects that occasionally surfaced from the ground, puzzling those who found them. It would take the modern world, with its new tools and relentless curiosity, to begin the long process of waking these giants from their slumber and giving a name to the nameless civilization. For nearly 2,000 years, the Olmecs existed only as echoes. The Maya, whose magnificent cities rose centuries after La Venta fell, may have known fragments of the old stories. They spoke of a primordial place of creation, a misty paradise called Tamunchin, where the gods established order. They inherited the sacred calendar, the ritual ballgame, the vision of a universe layered in 3 realms, and a profound reverence for jade and the jaguar. These were not their own inventions, but an inheritance. Yet the specific memory of the makers, the people who carved the colossal heads, had blurred into a general mythic past. The Aztecs, much later, collected and revered ancient artifacts they called tlacote, believing them to be tears of the rain gods or relics from a previous sun, a previous age of the world. They had no idea they were holding Olmec celts or figurines. The jungle had done its work well, swallowing not just the cities, but the very identity of the civilization. The Spanish conquest brought a new layer of oblivion. Friars and soldiers, focused on gold and souls, marched through the Veracruz lowlands without a glance for the strange mounds or the occasional massive stone peeking from the soil. The local indigenous people, descendants of those who had walked away so long ago, sometimes lived among the ruins, using the stones for foundations, but the original meaning was gone. The heads were thought to be crude idols, perhaps buried as punishment by Christian God or by some forgotten act of penance. They were curiosities, not chapters in history. The modern ray discovery was slow, piecemeal, and met with deep resistance. The 1862 report by Melgar Y. Serrano on the colossal head at Tres Zapotes was published in a scientific journal, but it was dismissed as an anomaly. The prevailing racial theories of the 19th century could not accept that such sophisticated, un-Indian features could be the product of Native American hands. This led to the proliferation of what we now call hyper-diffusionist fantasies. Scholars and amateur enthusiasts, looking at the broad noses and full lips of the heads, spun tales of lost tribes from Africa, shipwrecked Phoenicians, or survivors from the sunken continent of Atlantis. These theories, though racially biased and fundamentally flawed, captured the public imagination because the truth seemed too improbable. That a complex civilization had risen, fully formed, in the isolation of the Mexican jungle millennia before Columbus. The turning point came in the 1920s and 1930s, with the work of two men who approached the mystery with open eyes and rigorous methods. The first was Franz Blom, an explorer and archaeologist who mapped the site of La Venta and recognized its staggering scale and deliberate layout. He saw it not as a collection of odd mounds, but as a planned city. The second and most pivotal was Matthew Stirling. Funded by the National Geographic Society and the Smithsonian Institution, Stirling led a series of expeditions into the heart of the swamps. His team, including his remarkable wife Marion, faced malaria, torrential rains, and logistical nightmares. They used primitive airplanes for aerial surveys, revealing the hidden shapes of the ceremonial centers. They excavated at Tres Zapotes, La Venta, and San Lorenzo. It was Stirling who found the clinching evidence. At Tres Zapotes, he uncovered a broken stone monument. Stela C on it was a date inscribed in the familiar Maya long count calendar. But when he calculated it, the date read 32 BC. This was a shock. At the time, the Maya were considered the oldest civilization in the region, with their classic period starting around 250 AD. This date was centuries older. Then, at La Venta, he found offerings and monuments that were clearly the stylistic ancestors of later Maya art. The pattern became undeniable. The artifacts with the jaguar baby motifs, the colossal heads, the elaborate altars, all of it was part of a coherent culture, and it was older than the Maya. Stirling, in a series of popular articles in National Geographic, made the case to the world. Here was a mother culture, a fountainhead. He gave them the name we use today, drawn from the Aztec word for the region, the Olmecs. The academic battle was fierce. Powerful Mayanists like Sylvanus Morrill argued vehemently against Sterling, insisting the Olmecs were merely a contemporary, sister culture that had borrowed from the Maya. It was a clash of paradigms. But as more sites were excavated, the stratigraphy, the layer cake of history in the ground, told a clear story. Olmec-style pottery and artifacts were always found in the deepest, oldest layers. Carbon dating, a new tool in the 1950s, confirmed the staggering antiquity. San Lorenzo flourished from about 1400 to 900 BC. The case was settled. The Olmecs were not visitors, not Atlanteans, not a sideshow. They were the pioneers. The reluctant awakening was complete. A civilization had been pulled from the shadows and given its rightful place at the dawn of the American story. But with this acceptance came a new set of even more tantalizing and difficult questions. Questions that dig into the very origins of their sudden, brilliant spark. With the Olmecs firmly established as the first great civilization, the question turned from who were they to an even more profound mystery. Why here and why then? What combination of sparks ignited the flame of complexity in the humid lowlands of the Gulf Coast around 1400 BC? The search for the Olmec genesis leads us away from the grand stone monuments and into the quieter, older layers of earth, to the simple villages that dotted the rivers before kings and colossal heads. It is a story of maize, water, and a revolutionary idea that changed everything. For millennia, the people of this region lived as hunter-gatherers and fisher-foragers, exploiting the incredible richness of their environment. The rivers teemed with fish and turtles. The forests offered game. But the key to the transition from village to city lay in a humble grass, teosinte. This wild ancestor of maize, with its tiny, hard kernels, was first domesticated in the highlands of Mexico thousands of years earlier. By the second millennium BC, this knowledge had filtered down to the Gulf Coast. Through generations of selective breeding, these early Olmec ancestors transformed teosinte into a more productive, reliable source of food: maize. This was not just a new crop, it was a new relationship with time and the land. Farming requires planning, foresight, and a settled life. It creates surplus, and surplus changes society. With a more dependable food base, populations began to grow. Small villages along the riverbanks like El Manati and San Andres became permanent. At El Manati, a sacred spring, we see the earliest flicker of the Olmec spiritual world, centuries before the first pyramid. Here, people made offerings to the water, sinking beautifully carved wooden busts, rubber balls, and greenstone celts into the bog. This was a reverence for the life-giving and life-taking power of water, a theme that would become central to Olmec ideology. It shows a community already investing labor in creating ritual objects, a sign of shared belief and social cohesion. But the true catalyst for the explosive rise of San Lorenzo as the first capital may have been a dramatic act of environmental engineering. The site itself is not naturally defensible or exceptionally fertile. The Olmecs made it so. They moved mountains of earth, literally. They reshaped a natural ridge into a vast, artificial plateau, over 150 feet high and covering nearly 1,500 acres. This required the coordination of thousands of workers over generations. Why do it? The plateau provided a symbolic and practical center. It lifted the elite above the seasonal floods, a constant reminder of their elevated status. It also allowed for control. From this central place, emerging chiefs could manage labor, distribute surplus food, and coordinate the trade in exotic materials like obsidian and ilmenite that were flowing in from distant regions. This is where the spark truly caught fire, in the fusion of spiritual authority, economic control, and a brilliant, manipulative visual language. A charismatic leader, or a lineage of them, began to claim a special, direct connection to the forces that govern the most critical elements of life, rain and maize. They legitimized this claim not just with words, but with stunning, tangible displays of power. They commissioned the first monumental art. Before the colossal heads, there were the tabletop thrones and massive stone sculptures like the wrestler and the seated figures from San Lorenzo. These displayed a mastery of stone and human form that was previously unseen. They controlled the import and working of the most spiritually charged materials, like magnetite for mirrors that could catch and reflect sunlight like lightning, and jade, the stone of life. The idea of the divine king was born. This individual was no longer just a headman. He was the axis mundi, the living world tree connecting the watery underworld, the human realm, and the heavens. His well-being was tied to the well-being of the cosmos. The colossal head was the ultimate expression of this idea, an immortal, unshakable, gigantic portrait of that divine contract made stone. It was a billboard of power that said, "This man ensures the rains fall, the maize grows, and the world remains in balance." His demand for your labor is not tyranny. It is your sacred duty, your premium for cosmic insurance. Thus, the Olmec genesis was not a single event, but a chain reaction. The stability of maize agriculture allowed population growth. Growth required greater social organization. Ambitious leaders used spiritual belief, control of luxury goods, and staggering monumental art to centralize that organization into a hierarchy. They engineered their landscape to reflect this new order. And once this formula was perfected at San Lorenzo, it became a blueprint, a cultural package so potent that it began to spread, carried by trade, emulation, and perhaps even missionary-like zeal across Mesoamerica. They had invented a template for civilization itself. But to understand the full depth of their intellectual achievement, we must decipher the most enigmatic part of their legacy, not their stones, but their signs. We must look for the whisper of their words, the possibility that they were the first in the Americas to cross the ultimate threshold of complex society, the invention of writing. The colossal heads speak of power, the jade carvings whisper of the sacred, and the altars tell stories of dynastic lineage. But these are images, symbols. The leap from symbolic art to true writing is one of humanity's greatest intellectual revolutions. Writing allows for the recording of specific speech, of history, of names, of complex transactions and prayers. For a long time, the Maya were credited with developing the first writing system in the Americas. But a haunting question has persisted. Did the Olmecs get there first? Was there an Olmec script, a lost language carved on perishable wood or bark that rotted away in the humid jungle, leaving only the faintest of clues on a handful of stone objects? This is one of the deepest and most contentious mysteries in Olmec archaeology. a search for a ghost of a language. The evidence is tantalizing, fragmentary, and fiercely debated. It does not come from the heartland, but from the edges of the Olmec world, suggesting that the idea of recording language may have been part of their cultural toolkit, experimented with in their far-flung outposts. The most famous and compelling artifact is the Cascagel block. Discovered in a quarry in the Olmec heartland in the late 1990s, this is a fist-sized slab of serpentine stone. Its surface is covered with 62 finely incised signs, arranged in clear horizontal rows. The symbols are diverse. They include abstract shapes, like comb-like designs and circles with crosses, as well as recognizable icons like a throne, an insect, and what looks like a fish or an ear of maize. Crucially, they appear in a sequenced order with apparent repetition of certain signs, which is a hallmark of a true writing system capturing words or syllables. If authentic, the Cascagel block, dated to around 900 BC, would be the oldest writing in the Americas by nearly a millennium. But its authenticity has been questioned because it was not excavated by archaeologists in a controlled dig, leaving a shadow of doubt about its origins. Other pieces of the puzzle lie farther afield. At the Olmec-influenced site of Chalcatzingo, highland carvings on living rock show figures surrounded by complex speech scrolls and glyph-like symbols. At the distant site of Teopantequinitlan in Guerrero, an early Olmec-style inscription appears on a monument. But the most significant cluster of potential early writing comes from the Isthmus of Tehuantepec region, at a site called San Andres, near the Olmec center of La Venta. Here, in 2002, archaeologists found a cylindrical seal and fragments of a greenstone plaque. The cylindrical seal, if rolled on wet clay or bark paper, would produce a repeating pattern that includes two speech scrolls emerging from a bird's beak, flanked by two glyph-like signs. This has been interpreted as a possible royal title or a phrase, a stamp of ownership or authority. The greenstone plaque bears an incised sign that looks strikingly like the later Maya glyph for Agile, meaning lord or ruler. What does this patchwork of evidence suggest? Leading researchers like Mary Pohl and the late Kent Riley argue that the Olmecs were in a state of proto-writing. They were developing a system of glyphs that could convey names, titles, and perhaps key ritual concepts, but not full sentences or narratives. This system would have been an elite tool, used by the shaman king and his priests to legitimize power, to record sacred formulas, or to mark royal property. The speech scrolls, a visual convention showing words as a curled breath emanating from a mouth, are a critical Olmec invention. They represent the concept of spoken authority, the divine utterance of the ruler given visible form. This idea would be adopted and elaborated by every subsequent Mesoamerican culture. The Olmecs may not have had a fully developed literary tradition like the Maya, but they were almost certainly the conceptual inventors of the medium. They created the idea that specific, standardized signs could capture and transmit the power of the spoken word, especially the words of gods and kings. Their writing was likely deeply tied to ritual and political performance, not historical record-keeping. It was another tool of mystery and control, making the invisible, the spoken claim to divine lineage, visible and permanent. When the Olmec heartland declined, this nascent script may have faded in its place of origin. But the idea did not die. It traveled along the same trade routes that carried jade and ideology. It filtered into the emerging Zapotec culture in Oaxaca, who developed a hieroglyphic system by 500 BC. It influenced the peoples of the Isthmus, who may have passed the concept to the rising Maya in the lowlands. The Maya brilliant synthesizers would take this Olmec seed and grow it into a lush, complex forest of glyphs capable of recording poetry, astronomy, and history. So when we stare at a Maya inscription, we are likely seeing the distant, refined echo of an Olmec whisper, a whisper first carved into stone or stamped onto bark in the humid courts of La Venta. This intellectual legacy is perhaps their most profound gift. But to fully grasp their worldview, we must move beyond kings and words and into the very fabric of their daily life, into the homes, the diets, and the hands that built the miracles. The gaze of history, drawn by colossal stone and glittering jade, often fixes on the Olmec elite. The shaman kings, the priests, the master carvers. But the breath of their civilization came from the thousands whose names are lost, who lived and died without portraits in stone. To understand the Olmecs, we must step down from the high plateau of San Lorenzo and walk into the surrounding villages, into the wattle and daub houses with palm thatch roofs that clustered along the rivers and ridges. Here, in the rhythm of daily labor, the true engine of this early civilization hummed. These were not a people living in the shadow of greatness. They were the ones who made greatness possible. Their year was dictated by the rains and the river. During the growing season, they tended the fields of maize, beans, squash, and chili peppers. They likely used a system of raised fields and riverbank gardens, turning the challenging wetlands into a breadbasket. They were masterful fishers, using nets and spears to harvest the rich protein of the rivers and coastal lagoons. They hunted deer, tapir, and peccary in the forests. They gathered fruits, nuts, and the all-important sap of the rubber tree. The Olmecs are, in fact, the first people known to have used rubber. They harvested the latex and processed it, perhaps by mixing it with morning glory juice, to create bouncy balls for their sacred ballgame, waterproof containers, and maybe even adhesive or ritual items. They lived in a world of abundant, if demanding, natural resources. The social fabric was woven from this daily toil. Most people lived in extended family compounds, producing what they needed. But a portion of their labor and their harvest was committed to the social contract, tribute to the center. This tribute fed the rulers, priests, and specialized artisans who did not farm. It provided the fuel for grand projects. When the call came for a collective labor enterprise, to reshape a plateau, to haul a colossal head, these villagers would have answered. This was not necessarily slavery. It was likely a communal religious duty, a tequio, a concept still found in Mesoamerican communities today. Their labor was an offering, part of a reciprocal relationship where the elite provided spiritual security and access to exotic goods. Within this society, there were special roles. There were potters who crafted the distinctive Olmec ceramics, sleek blackware and white slipped vessels, some carved with fine line motifs of gods and icons. There were weavers, though their textiles have long since vanished in the humidity, leaving only impressions on clay or stone. There were carvers of wood and bone, creating tools and ornaments. And there were, of course, the stoneworkers. These artisans held a high status. They understood the soul of the stone. Apprentices would have learned for years, starting with smaller pieces of jade or serpentine before graduating to the monumental basalt. Their workshops have been found at sites like La Venta, areas littered with flakes of stone, unfinished celts, and broken drills. The creation of a colossal head was the work of a lifetime, a team of masters and assistants painstakingly pecking, grinding, and polishing with harder stone and sand, bringing a ruler's face from the raw volcanic rock. Life was deeply intertwined with the spiritual. In their homes, people likely kept small figurines, often of babies or pudgy, sexless individuals. These were not toys, but powerful objects. They may have represented ancestors, household spirits, or symbols of fertility and renewal. They were intimate companions in daily life, connecting the domestic sphere to the cosmic order maintained by the king. Health and medicine were likely a mix of practical herbal knowledge and shamanic healing, treating a broken bone with a splint and a fever with prayers to the jaguar deity of disease. The picture that emerges is not of a downtrodden peasantry, but of an integrated society where every layer had a purpose understood within a sacred framework. The farmer's maize fed the carver, whose jade adornment glorified the king, whose rituals brought the rain for the farmer's maize. It was a circular, interdependent world. This delicate balance made the civilization flourish, but it also made it vulnerable. When the environmental or social stresses became too great, when the rains failed or the king's spiritual power was questioned, this intricate web could unravel from the bottom up, as the people at San Lorenzo demonstrated. The monuments are the Olmecs' legacy to history, but the true story is written in the countless, quiet acts of planting, fishing, carving, and believing that happened every day in the green embrace of the land of rubber. This holistic view of their world leads us inevitably to the most dramatic and public of their rituals, a spectacle that fused sport, politics, and cosmic drama into a single, often deadly game. The sound would have been unforgettable, a deep, solid thump that echoed across the plastered plaza, a sound like a heartbeat made by the gods. It was the sound of a solid rubber ball, sometimes weighing 8 pounds or more, striking against the hip, elbow, or thigh of a player. This was not a game for leisure. This was the Olmec ballgame, known later as Alamalistli to the Aztecs, a ritual so central to their worldview that its court was a fundamental feature of every ceremonial center. For the Olmecs, it was more than a sport. It was a reenactment of the cosmic struggle, a dance with destiny where the fate of the world and the very lives of the players hung in the balance. The Olmec ballgame is the oldest known team sport in the world. While no formal, stone-walled ball court has been definitively identified in the heartland, the earliest such structures appear in the Highland Olmec-influenced sites. The evidence for the game is overwhelming. They had the rubber for the balls, a material unique to their region. They had the protective gear. The colossal heads wear what are almost certainly thick, padded helmets and stone yokes and hatches, later used as ceremonial equipment, may have evolved from actual protective belts worn by players. Most importantly, they had the imagery. Carvings and figurines depict players in dynamic poses, often with one knee on the ground, leaning forward to strike the heavy ball with their hips. The game was laden with symbolism that would endure for millennia in Mesoamerica. The court itself represented the cosmos. The flat playing alley was the world of the living, suspended between two parallel walls or markers that symbolized the heavens and the underworld. The ball, bouncing unpredictably between these realms, was the sun, the moon, or a celestial body on its perilous journey through the sky and the dark realm of night. The players were not just athletes. They were mythic heroes, stand-ins for the hero twins of later Maya legend who outwitted the lords of death, or for the gods who battled to ensure the sun would rise again. But this cosmic drama had a stark, earthly parallel. The game was deeply political. It was a venue for competition between city-states or factions within a city. Rulers would have played or sponsored teams to demonstrate their physical prowess, their connection to heroic ancestors, and their ability to influence cosmic outcomes. Victory was a sign of divine favor. Defeat could be catastrophic. There is strong evidence that the Olmecs, like their successors, sometimes practiced ritual sacrifice in connection with the game. Several colossal heads have been found with what appear to be score-like marks carved on their helmets, perhaps tallying victories. The most chilling link comes from a combination of artifacts at El Manati, the sacred spring. Here, among the ritual offerings, archaeologists found rubber balls and the bones of human infants. This suggests that from the earliest times, the game was tied to the most profound of offerings, human life. The outcome of the game could determine who was sacrificed. In later cultures, it was often the captain of the losing team who was decapitated, his head perhaps becoming a symbolic seed to ensure fertility and renewal. The imagery is potent. The ball, representing the human head or the sun, is kept in play, its life sustained by the player's skill. When it finally stops, a life must be given to renew the cosmic cycle. The ball court was therefore a portal, a place where the mundane and divine violently intersected. The thunderous impact of the rubber ball was the sound of worlds colliding. For the common people watching from the edges of the plaza, the game was a terrifying and exhilarating spectacle. It was a living metaphor for their own existence, a struggle against powerful, unseen forces, where skill, ritual, and the favor of the gods determined survival. It reinforced the social order, showcasing the elite as the crucial intermediaries who literally fought for cosmic and communal stability. The game distilled the Olmec universe into a single dramatic performance, a world of duality, of life and death, of struggle and renewal, all played out to the relentless heartbeat thump of rubber on flesh. This deep engagement with cosmic cycles extended beyond the ball court, however, and into a silent, precise observation of the heavens themselves, where the Olmecs sought to map the patterns of time and power. Above the steamy green canopy of the rainforest, beyond the reach of the jaguar and the roots of the ceiba tree, lay another, more orderly realm, the night sky. To the Olmecs, the heavens were not a random scatter of lights, but a grand, turning mechanism, a celestial clockwork that governed the rhythms of rain, drought, planting, and harvest. They were not just observers of this mechanism. They were its diligent students, perhaps its first American architects. Their cities were not merely collections of buildings. They were vast stone calendars aligned to the dance of the cosmos, designed to harness its power and predict its moods. The most profound evidence of this lies in the very bones of their cities. Take La Venta. Its central ceremonial complex is not aligned to true north. Instead, it is rotated 8 degrees west of north. For decades, this was seen as an odd error. But researchers like archaeoastronomer John Carlson have proposed a compelling theory. This axis aligns with the setting point of a particular star group at a critical time of year, or perhaps tracked the path of the sun at the zenith passage, the day it passes directly overhead, a powerful solar event in the tropics. This intentional misalignment suggests the Olmecs were carefully marking specific celestial events, embedding them into the landscape. Even more striking is the layout of the monumental core. The major mounds and structures are arranged along a precise north-south axis over a mile long. This axis is not a straight line, but one that seems to incorporate sacred geometry, perhaps reflecting cosmic proportions. The placement of the massive offerings, the hidden mosaics and caches of precious celts, along this line created a kind of spiritual battery, a chain of energized points connecting the earth to celestial patterns. The Great Pyramid itself, a fluted cone, may have served as an observation platform. From its summit, priests could watch the sun rise over specific mounds or markers on the horizon on solstices or equinoxes, turning the entire city into a giant observatory. Their timekeeping genius is most famously encapsulated in the long count calendar, a complex, linear measure of days that would become the hallmark of classic Maya civilization. But the oldest long count dates ever found are on Olmec monuments. Stela C from Tres Zapotes, with its date of 32 BC, is the earliest secure example. This reveals a staggering fact. The Olmecs, not the Maya, were the originators of this system. The long count is a count of days from a mythical starting point, a day zero that likely corresponded to the creation of the current world order. It allowed them to plot events on a vast timeline stretching thousands of years into the past and future. This was more than practical farming almanac. It was a theology of time. It expressed a belief in cyclical eras, in world ages that were born and died just as maize grew, was harvested, and was replanted. The shaman king's role was to maintain the count, to perform the rituals on the correct day, to keep time itself on track. Their astronomical knowledge likely went beyond the sun and stars to include the planet Venus, the brilliant morning and evening star that was seen as a dangerous, warlike deity by later cultures. They may have tracked the cycles of the moon. All of this learning was not abstract science. It was sacred knowledge, the ultimate source of the elite's power. By predicting the rainy season, the solar zenith, or the movements of Venus, the priests and kings demonstrated their intimate conversation with the cosmos. They could prove their ability to intercede with the forces that made maize grow and water flow. This control of time and celestial knowledge was the foundation upon which their political and spiritual authority was built. It justified the labor demanded for their projects. They were not just building monuments. They were building instruments to ensure the continuity of the world. This deep temporal awareness must have shaped their very perception of reality. They lived not just in the present, but within a vast, measured cycle of creation and destruction. The burial of their monuments, the careful sealing of offerings in layered earth, were acts done on a sacred schedule, plugging energy into the cosmic machine at the right moment. They saw themselves as stewards of a fragile, ticking order. When their world eventually faltered, when the rains failed despite correct rituals, when the stars seemed to shift in a malevolent way. It wasn't just an environmental disaster. It was a failure of the cosmic order they had so meticulously charted and sought to control, a crack in the very architecture of time they had built. This sense of profound interconnection between earth and sky leads us to consider another, more tangible form of connection: the vast web of trade and influence that stretched from their heartland, a web that carried not just goods, but the very idea of civilization itself to distant, waiting peoples. The Olmec world was not confined by the swampy borders of the Coatzacoalcos Basin. Their influence flowed out like ripples from a stone dropped in water, reaching distant shores and high mountain valleys. This was not an empire of conquest marked by forts and armies, but an empire of the mind, propagated by trade, diplomacy, and the sheer persuasive power of a revolutionary culture. To trace the paths of Olmec travelers and traders is to map the first highways of complex thought in the Americas. The most direct evidence comes from the presence of raw materials. The Olmec heartland had basalt and clay in abundance, but it lacked the spiritually critical commodities: jadeite, serpentine, obsidian, magnetite, and iridescent feathers. The sources of these materials became destinations. In the rugged Motagua River valley of Guatemala, the source of the finest jade Olmec-style artifacts have been found. It was likely an Olmec enclave or a closely allied community that controlled the initial quarrying and rough shaping of the stone before it began its long journey north. Similarly, at the great obsidian deposits in Pachuca and Guadalupe, Victoria, near modern Mexico City, Olmec-style figurines appear. They were there for the black volcanic glass, a material prized for its sharpness and used for ritual bloodletting implements and mirrors. But the Olmec footprint is not just found in quarries. It is found in fully formed, distant ceremonial centers that echo the heartland's vision. Chalcatzingo in the highlands of Morelos is the most spectacular example. Here, on a massive rock face, Olmec artists carved an elaborate scene. A powerful ruler sits within the gaping mouth of a stylized cave, a caterfoil symbol, the Olmec emblem for a portal to the underworld, framing the entrance. Above, clouds rain down, and symbols of abundance fill the space. This is classic Olmec iconography, but it is carved over 300 miles from La Venta. Chalcatzingo was likely a highland colony, a permanent settlement established to control trade routes for precious stones and to project Olmec ideology into a new region. The local elite would have adopted Olmec styles to legitimize their own rule, wrapping themselves in the prestige of the lowland masters. Further south, along the Pacific coast of what is now Guatemala and Chiapas, sites like Tacalic Abaj and Izapa tell a more complex story. Here, archaeologists find a fascinating blend. There are pure Olmec objects, carvings of were-jaguars and pottery with Olmec designs. But there are also early examples of motifs that would later become quintessentially Maya, like the hooked-nose rain god Chak and depictions of the maize deity. These sites were not pure Olmec colonies. They were vibrant, cosmopolitan melting pots where the Olmec mother culture interacted with local traditions. The Olmecs provided a toolkit of symbols, rituals, and political concepts, which local innovators began to adapt and change. This region may have been the crucial incubator where Olmec ideas slowly transformed into what would become Maya civilization. How was this influence maintained? It was likely a combination of methods. There would have been direct colonization in key resource areas like Chalcatzingo. There would have been skilled itinerant artisans, Olmec master carvers who traveled to the courts of ambitious local chiefs, creating monuments for them in the fashionable, powerful style of the heartland. There would have been diplomatic marriages, creating kinship ties that bound distant elites to Olmec lineages. And underpinning it all was trade, the steady flow of exotic goods from the heartland outward and the flow of raw materials inward. To possess an Olmec-style jade pectoral or to have an Olmec-style monument in your plaza was to claim a connection to the source of cosmic power. This far-flung network was the Olmec's greatest legacy, and perhaps their greatest vulnerability. It required constant maintenance, a steady flow of goods and ideological energy from the center. When the heartland cities of San Lorenzo and later La Venta began to falter under environmental and social strain, the network shuddered. The colonies were cut off from their spiritual and economic wellspring. Local elites, no longer receiving the latest symbols or goods, began to innovate on their own, gradually shedding the pure Olmec style and developing regional variants. The ripple effect reversed. The center could no longer hold, and the far horizons became independent worlds. But the seed had been planted. From the highlands of Mexico to the forests of Guatemala, the Olmec idea of the divine king, the ceremonial center, the sacred ballgame, the written glyph, and the cosmic calendar had taken root. It would lie dormant for a time, like seeds waiting for the next rain, before erupting in a glorious, diverse flowering of successor civilizations, each forever in debt to the giants of the swamp. The Olmec world was populated by more than just kings and farmers. It was a realm thick with divine presence, where every mountain, spring, and storm was animated by spirit. Unlike later Mesoamerican cultures with their clearly defined gods of rain, sun, and war, the Olmec pantheon is elusive, a gallery of masks that blend and shift. Their deities are not separate personalities so much as fluid manifestations of fundamental powers: earth, water, sky, and the terrifying, fertile energy of the animal world. To understand their gods is to step into a cosmology where boundaries are porous, and transformation is the highest law. The most dominant, overwhelming presence is the were-jaguar. This is not a single god, but a divine principle, the essence of a merger. It represents the union of the human and the jaguar, the child of a jaguar mother and a human father according to one later myth. Its image, a snarling infant with a cleft head, fanged mouth, and almond-shaped eyes, is the very signature of Olmec art. But what does it signify? It is likely the rain god in its most primal, stormy form. The jaguar, lord of the night and the rainforest, is the embodiment of thunder. The infant represents new life, the maize sprout. The cleft head is the fissure in the earth from which life springs, and also the furrow in a field. When this being cries, it rains. Its snarl is the thunderclap. This deity is not kindly. It is a force of terrifying power that must be appeased with offerings and rituals to channel its energy into life-giving rain rather than destructive flood. Closely tied to this is the earth monster, often depicted as a gaping, dragonesque mouth on altars and thrones. This is the entrance to the underworld, the cave from which all life emerged and to which it returns. Rulers are shown sitting within this maw or emerging from it, holding were-jaguar infants. This communicates a profound truth. The king's authority is born from the earth itself. He is the human point of contact with the fertile, dark, and dangerous realm below. The earth monster is also the mountain, the source of water and caves. At Chalkitsingo, the ruler literally sits inside the carved mouth of the mountain, becoming one with the earth's generative power. Then there is the Feathered Serpent. While this deity would become the famed Quetzalcoatl of the Aztecs and Kukulkan of the Maya, its earliest known depiction is Olmec. A beautiful stone sculpture from La Venta shows a serpent with a crest of feathers and a ridged brow, its body coiled. This being bridges realms, the serpent of the earth now adorned with the feathers of the sky. It represents wind, the breath of life, the movement that connects the underworld, the human world, and the heavens. It is a symbol of rulership and spiritual authority, perhaps an early vision of the priest-king's ability to transcend the layers of the cosmos. We also see a possible maize god. While not as explicitly defined as the later Maya version, many figurines and carvings depict a slender, elegant individual with a serene, elongated head, often with a cleft. This may be the beautiful, human aspect of the plant that sustained life, the result of the were-jaguar's stormy blessing transformed into sustenance. Offerings of greenstone celts, shaped like maize kernels or shoots, were prayers to this deity. Finally, there is the enigmatic figure often called the bird monster or the Olmec dragon, a composite creature seen on incised pottery and carvings. It combines features of birds, snakes, and jaguars, with flame-like brows and crossed bands in its eyes. This may be a celestial symbol, a representation of the sky or a particular constellation, another piece of the cosmic map. What is revolutionary about the Olmec spiritual system is its integration. These are not separate gods fighting for attention. They are interconnected facets of a single dynamic universe. The were-jaguar, storm rain, interacts with the earth monster, cave earth, to produce the maize god, sustenance. The feathered serpent, wind spirit, moves between them all. The king, through ritual, bloodletting, and the ballgame, navigates this ecosystem of power. He channels the were-jaguar's fury, emerges from the earth monster's mouth, and embodies the feathered serpent's transcendence to ensure the maize god's bounty for his people. Their art is a constant dialogue among these forces. This complex, integrated vision of the sacred was their most profound export, a complete operating system for the universe that every culture after them would install, adapt, and build them. It was a system so powerful that even when their cities fell, their gods lived on, migrating into new lands and new temples, forever wearing the masks first carved in the humid workshops of San Lorenzo. The air in the cleared plaza would have been heavy, not just with humidity, but with expectation. The gathered people, their faces upturned, watched the slow, deliberate ascent of the shaman king and his priests up the flank of the earthen pyramid. This was not a spectacle for entertainment. It was a critical operation on the body of the world. For the Olmecs, the cosmos was a living entity that required constant nourishment, a fragile equilibrium maintained not by prayer alone, but by the most potent offering imaginable, human life force. Their rituals were the practical mechanics of keeping reality functioning. At the core of this belief was the concept of sacred energy, a kind of animating force that flowed through all things: people, animals, plants, stones, and rain. This energy could stagnate, leak, or be exhausted. The duty of the ruler and the priesthood was to replenish it, to open channels between the human realm and the divine sources of power. The most direct way to do this was through the offering of ExistThe, the life essence found most powerfully in blood, and in the ultimate sacrifice, the human heart. Bloodletting was a fundamental Olmec ritual, likely practiced by the elite. Sharp implements of obsidian or stingray spines have been found in high-status burials. These were not weapons, but sacred tools. We see depictions on figurines and celts of individuals in trance-like states, perhaps auto-sacrificing by drawing blood from their tongues, ears, or genitals. The blood was collected on strips of bark paper, which were then burned. The rising smoke and scent were believed to be literal food for the gods, a nourishing steam that carried the essence of royal lineage directly to the spirits. Through this act, the king, in a state of visionary pain, would commune with ancestors and deities, becoming the conduit through which divine will flowed into the human world. His blood was the price of the conversation. But for the most serious cosmic crises, a prolonged drought, the dedication of a new temple, the death of a king, a more profound payment was required: human sacrifice. The evidence, while circumstantial, is persuasive. The sacred spring at El Manati contained the remains of infants, carefully arranged alongside rubber balls and jade celts. This suggests a ritual drowning or offering to the water deities, perhaps to ensure the spring's life-giving flow. The colossal heads, with their helmet-like gear, connect the rulers to the ballgame, a ritual deeply tied to decapitation sacrifice in later periods. The defacing and burying of monuments at San Lorenzo may have been accompanied by the sacrificial killing of the ruler's retainers, to accompany him and the old order into the underworld. The act of sacrifice was not one of cruelty, but of terrible responsibility and transaction. The victim, often a captured warrior from a rival group or a specially selected individual from within the community, became a vessel. Their death released a massive burst of sacred energy, a jolt of ExistThe that could recharge the cosmos, appease an angry were-jaguar rain god, or sanctify a new space. The heart, the source of life's rhythm, or the head, the seat of identity, were the most potent offerings. In the ball game, the bouncing rubber ball symbolized this severed head, its movement keeping the life in play until ritual concluded it. These rituals were performed in specific, charged locations, atop pyramids that mimicked sacred mountains, in sunken plaza courts that represented the underworld, or at the water's edge where realms met. Timing, dictated by their celestial calendar, was everything. A sacrifice performed on the wrong day would be useless or even dangerous. A bloodletting done during the zenith passage of the sun would have maximum effect. For the common people, these rituals were both terrifying and reassuring. They demonstrated the king's ultimate commitment. He was willing to spill his own blood and orchestrate the ultimate gift to maintain their world. It validated the social order. The elite were not just consumers of tribute, but brave participants in a deadly exchange with the supernatural on behalf of all. The scent of burning blood in the plaza was the smell of the covenant being renewed. It was the stark, brutal, and from their perspective, necessary technology of survival in a world where the jungle could reclaim fields in a season, and the skies could withhold their life-giving tears for years. This cycle of offering and renewal, however, would eventually confront a challenge it could not answer, as the very elements they sought to appease turned against them in a slow, relentless siege. The Olmec shaman king stood at the summit of the Great Pyramid, the weight of his jade-laden regalia a mere feather compared to the weight he now bore. Below him, the people waited. The rituals had been performed with exacting precision. The blood offering had been generous, the chants flawless, the calendar meticulously followed. Yet the sky remained a hard, cloudless bowl of brass. The rivers, once proud avenues of trade and life, had shrunk to muddy trickles. The maize in the field stood stunted, its leaves curling in despair. This was the unanswerable crisis, when the cosmology fails. The slow-motion collapse of the Olmec heartland was not sparked by invasion, but by a betrayal from the very forces they had spent centuries learning to appease. The environment itself became the siege engine. Modern paleoclimatologists, reading the diaries of ancient lakes and seabeds, have reconstructed a troubling chapter. The Olmec Golden Age, from roughly 1200 to 400 BC, coincided with a period of relatively stable, abundant rainfall. The swamps were full, the rivers navigable, the water table high. This was the foundation upon which their agricultural surplus and dense populations were built. But climate is not a permanent contract. Core samples from the Gulf of Mexico and nearby lakes tell a story of increasing instability. A shift in larger weather patterns, perhaps related to changes in ocean temperatures or atmospheric currents, brought a new regime to the region: intense volatility. This meant punishing droughts that could last for years, baking the earth and evaporating the shallow wetlands that were the breadbasket of their raised field agriculture. A single drought season could be weathered, but multi-year failures broke the system. Famine would have begun in the hinterlands, then pressed inward toward the ceremonial centers. The people's tribute, the maize that fed the elite and the labor crews, would have dwindled to nothing. But the volatility also brought its opposite: catastrophic floods. When the rains finally returned, they did not come as gentle life-givers, but as furious deluges. These floods would have scoured the carefully engineered fields, silted up canals, and possibly even toppled the earthen architecture of the cities themselves. The Olmecs were masters of water management, but they were not prepared for the pendulum to swing with such violent force. This environmental stress triggered a cascade of failures. The first to break was faith. The shaman king's entire legitimacy was predicated on his unique ability to intercede with the forces of rain and fertility. When his rituals consistently failed to bring the rains or stop the floods, his divine contract was void. He was exposed not as a god, but as a man who could not deliver. The social unrest that had once boiled over at San Lorenzo would have simmered and erupted again across the heartland. The colossal heads, those stone guarantees of divine order, now stared out over failing fields, their immutable expressions seeming like a hollow mockery. The second failure was economic. The long-distance trade networks, the veins of jade, obsidian, and exotic goods that fed the elite's prestige economy, depended on stability and surplus. Porters cannot travel through famine-stricken lands. Local allies, facing their own crises, would halt the flow of luxury items to a center that could no longer reciprocate with spiritual benefits or practical aid. The heartland began to starve not just of food, but of the symbols of its own power. There is also strong evidence that the Olmecs contributed to their own downfall through ecological overreach. To build La Venta's massive pyramid, millions of baskets of clay were stripped from the surrounding landscape. This widespread excavation, coupled with deforestation for agriculture and settlement, would have caused severe local environmental degradation. Deforestation leads to soil erosion, loss of biodiversity, and can even reduce local rainfall. They may have inadvertently turned their homeland into a less resilient, less fertile place, amplifying the effects of the broader climate shifts. The land, over-solicited and overstressed, pushed back. The result was not a sudden evacuation, but an agonizingly slow dispersal. Families and whole communities, seeing no future in the heartland, made the rational choice to leave. They migrated to the highlands, the coasts, and the rising centers in the valley of Oaxaca and the Maya highlands, places where the climate shocks may have been less severe or where different agricultural strategies could cope. They took their knowledge, their stories, and their gods with them. The great cities were not destroyed. They were simply left behind, their populations melting away into the wider landscape. The pyramids became overgrown hills, the plazas became meadows, and the colossal heads slowly tilted and sank into the soft, hungry earth, as if the land itself was reclaiming its children. The siege was over. The civilization had not been conquered. It had been gradually, utterly absorbed back into the green silence from which it had emerged. The great Olmec cities fell silent, but the world they had conjured did not vanish. It fragmented, like a shattered mirror, and each piece reflected their image into a new age. The people walked away from La Venta and San Lorenzo, carrying in their memories and traditions the blueprint for civilization. This blueprint was not a set of laws to be copied, but a vocabulary of power and the sacred to be adapted. As the Olmec heartland faded into legend, its children, the Zapotec, the Maya, the people of Teotihuacan, began to speak with their own voices, yet their sentences were built on Olmec grammar. The most direct line of inheritance stretches southwest to the valley of Oaxaca. Here, the Zapotec civilization was rising at Monte Alban, a city built on a stark, fortified mountaintop. The Zapotecs were brilliant innovators, but their foundational ideas are Olmec. They adopted and supercharged the Olmec fascination with writing and calendrics, developing one of the earliest fully functional writing systems in the Americas by 500 BC. Their glyphs for places and events, while distinct, spring from the same conceptual well as the symbols on the Cascadal block. They built ball courts for the sacred game. Most tellingly, they carved hundreds of stone slabs known as the danzantes, the dancers. These show contorted, tortured figures, likely slain enemies or sacrificial victims. The style is uniquely Zapotec, but the core idea, the public display of captives and the taking of life for political and cosmic power, is pure Olmec doctrine, a brutal extension of the themes played out in the ballgame and in ritual sacrifice. To the east, in the lush forests of the Maya lowlands, the Olmec seed found its most glorious and elaborate flowering. The Maya are often seen as the apex of Mesoamerican civilization, but they stood on Olmec shoulders. The Olmecs gave them the long count calendar, the very engine of Maya time-keeping and prophecy. They gave them the concept of the divine king, the Ke-Yuhul-Ajo, the holy lord who communicated with ancestors through bloodletting visions. The Maya ballgame, with its elaborate stone courts and mythic narrative of the hero twins, is an epic poem built on an Olmec foundation. Even their pantheon is an elaboration of Olmec prototypes. The Maya rain god Chak, with his reptilian features, is a direct descendant of the Olmec were-jaguar. The Feathered Serpent, known as Kukulkan, slithers through Maya mythology as it first did in Olmec art. Early Maya sites like Saros and Nak show clear Olmec stylistic influence in their earliest layers, as if the local elite first put on Olmec cultural clothing before tailoring it into their own magnificent style. North, in the highland basin where the colossal city of Teotihuacan would later arise, the Olmec influence is more subtle but no less profound. Teotihuacan, the city of the gods, was a vast, cosmopolitan metropolis that rejected the cult of the individual king in favor of a more collective governance. Yet, its entire urban plan is a cosmic diagram, a concept pioneered at La Venta. Its pyramids of the sun and moon are monumental expressions of the sacred mountain, just as the Olmec mound was. The cult of the Feathered Serpent, so central to Teotihuacan's later expansion, finds its first stone-carved expression in Olmec country. The Teotihuacanos may have rejected the colossal head, but they embraced and expanded the Olmec vision of the city as a machine for managing cosmic energy. This legacy reveals the true nature of the Olmec mother culture. They were not inventors who kept their secrets, but pioneers who blazed a trail so compelling that everyone had to follow it. They provided a toolkit, the ceremonial center, the calendar, writing, the ballgame, the bloodletting rite, the specific imagery of power. Different groups picked up different tools and used them to solve their own problems, to build their own identities. The Olmecs themselves became mythologized. They may be the giants of Popol Vuh, the Maya creation story, or the inhabitants of the mystical place of origin, Tamonchan. Their real history was forgotten, but their cultural DNA was replicated in every great civilization that came after. Their silence was not an end, but a transformation. They became the bedrock, the deep, unseen layer upon which the vibrant, noisy empires of later centuries were built. Their story was over, but for modern archaeology, the task of uncovering that story, of confronting its mysteries and its controversies, was just beginning. The story of the Olmecs is not a book closed for 2 millennia. It is a living, breathing detective story, its pages still being uncovered, one careful trowel scrape at a time. The modern hunt for the Olmecs is a dance between high technology and back-breaking physical labor, between satellite imagery and the muddy hands of a digger kneeling in a trench. It is a pursuit that has moved from simply finding spectacular objects to asking profound questions about how their society functioned, why it rose, and how it truly fell. Every answer unearths 3 new mysteries. The tools of the hunt have evolved dramatically. Where Matthew Stirling used machetes and biplanes, today's archaeologists use LIDAR, light detection and ranging. This technology, fired from a plane, penetrates the dense jungle canopy to map the ground beneath, revealing the ghostly footprints of human engineering. LeDAR surveys over the Olmec heartland have unveiled a shocking truth. The landscape is far more densely packed than anyone imagined. What appeared to be isolated ceremonial centers like San Lorenzo are now seen as the cores of vast, complex settlements, with networks of roads, canals, residential districts, and outlier villages stretching for miles. The Olmecs were not just building monuments. They were engineering entire landscapes on a staggering scale. This revelation forces a complete rethinking of their population size, their social organization, and their environmental impact. In the dirt of these newly mapped sites, archaeologists now employ micro-strategies. They sift soil with water to recover the tiniest seeds, fish bones, and insect remains, reconstructing the ancient diet and environment in exquisite detail. They analyze soil chemistry in plazas to find the footprint of long-vanished market stalls, searching for evidence of Olmec economies. They use ground-penetrating radar to locate buried offerings without digging, preserving the context until the perfect moment. The goal is no longer just to find treasure, but to understand the fabric of daily life, the economy of the commoner, the flow of goods, and the slow creep of ecological change. Some of the hottest debates in archaeology today swirl around the Olmecs. The mother culture versus sister culture debate may be settled for most, but new ones have taken its place. One major question is the nature of their political system. Were they a unified, state-level society with a capital and provinces, or a collection of powerful, rival chiefdoms that shared a common culture like city-states? The evidence from LeDAR, showing multiple large centers existing simultaneously, leans toward the latter. Another fierce debate revolves around the Cascadal block and the origins of writing. Is it genuine Olmec script? If so, how widespread was literacy? The search is on for more examples, a second inscription to confirm the system. Perhaps the most profound modern investigations focus on their downfall. Scientists are now coring deep into the sediments of ancient lakes near Olmec sites, analyzing pollen, charcoal, and mineral content year by year, almost season by season. They are looking for the precise timeline of drought and flood, trying to correlate climate events with archaeological evidence of fire, unrest, and abandonment. Was it one mega drought? A series of volcanic eruptions from the Tuxtla Mountains that blanketed fields in ash? Or, as some now suggest, did a rise in sea level salt their coastal aquifers and farming zones? The collapse is no longer seen as a single event, but as a complex web of stressors. Each new discovery is a piece of the puzzle, but the picture keeps expanding. A recent find of an Olmec-style mural in a cave in Guatemala, thousands of miles from the heartland, reignites questions about the reach of their pilgrims or missionaries. The analysis of DNA from skeletal remains, though extremely rare due to the acidic soils, holds the potential to trace Olmec migrations and their biological legacy in later peoples. The modern hunt is a humbling reminder that for all we have learned, the Olmecs still guard many secrets. They are a civilization that continues to challenge us, to force us to develop new tools and new questions, ensuring that their story, etched in stone and earth, is one we are still learning how to read. For all the trenches dug, the artifacts cataloged, and the theories debated, the Olmecs remain at their core, a civilization of shadows and whispers. The hard facts of archaeology provide a skeleton, a timeline, a map, a catalog of objects. But the flesh and blood of their world, the pulse of their thoughts and the nuances of their beliefs often elude our grasp. This is not a failure of science, but a testament to the depth of the mystery. Even as we reconstruct their cities, we confront silent voids and puzzles that resist easy answers, reminding us that some aspects of the past choose to remain sacred, known only to those who lived them. One of the most profound silences is the absence of a Rosetta Stone for their language. We have the Cascadule block with its tantalizing symbols, the glyph-like marks on seals and plaques, but we cannot read them. Without a bilingual text, without a clear link to a known language, these signs remain mute. Were they purely logographic, each symbol representing a whole word or concept? Did they have a syllabic component, capturing the sounds of speech? We see what might be names or titles on monuments, but we cannot pronounce them. The rulers depicted in the colossal heads had names, powerful words that commanded respect and fear. Those names are lost. We can describe their faces in minute detail, but we cannot call out to them across the centuries. This linguistic void separates us from their history, their poetry, their laws, and their personal prayers. We see the output of a sophisticated mind, but we are deaf to its voice. Closely tied to this is the riddle of their origins and ethnicity. The distinctive features of the colossal heads, broad noses, full lips, strong jaws, sparked those early, misguided theories of transoceanic contact. Modern scholarship dismisses these diffusionist ideas, pointing to the wholly American development of their culture. Yet the question of who they were biologically remains. From what stock of early Americans did they emerge? Were they the descendants of the first inhabitants of the region, or did they coalesce from a mixing of different groups drawn to the fertile rivers? The skeletal evidence is tragically sparse. The acidic soils and humid climate of the Gulf Coast are brutal on bone. The few remains we have are fragmentary. Advanced genetic testing holds promise, but requires exceptionally well-preserved material. Until we have more DNA evidence, their biological story, their familial connections to the Maya or others, remains a chapter written in invisible ink. Then there are the enigmas of specific artifacts that defy explanation. The purpose of the massive stone, tabletop, altars, with their intricate carvings of rulers emerging from caves, is understood in a general sense, but what specific ceremonies were performed upon them? What was the exact function of the finely polished concave mirrors of magnetite? Were they used to start fires, as astronomical tools to reflect celestial bodies, or as hypnotic devices for inducing shamanic trances when flashed in the sunlight? The precise rules and scoring of the sacred ballgame are lost. We know it was played, we know it was deadly, but we do not know the point system, the team sizes, or the exact conditions that dictated a sacrificial outcome. Perhaps the most haunting unanswered question is the most human one. What did it feel like to live in that world? We can describe the smell of burning copal and wet earth, the sound of the rubber ball thumping, the sight of the king ascending the pyramid. But we cannot access the inner life of an Olmec farmer watching that ascent. What complex mixture of awe, fear, gratitude, and resentment filled his heart. How did a mother understand the sacrifice of an infant to the spring? How did a carver feel after years of work as he put the final polish on the eye of a colossal head, knowing he had helped create an immortal god-king? These subjective experiences, the emotional texture of a vanished world, are beyond the reach of trowels and scanners. These enduring enigmas are not frustrations. They are invitations. They keep the Olmecs from becoming mere specimens in a museum case. The gaps in our knowledge are the spaces where wonder lives. They remind us that the past is not a problem to be solved, but a conversation to be continued, a distant shore we can approach but never fully land upon. The silent heads still hold their secrets close, and in that silence they maintain their power, compelling us to keep looking, keep questioning, and keep listening for the faintest echo in the green stone. To view the Olmecs solely through their artifacts is to see a tree but miss the forest. Their true monument was not any single pyramid or head, but the landscape itself. They did not simply build on the land. They engaged in a profound, reciprocal dialogue with it, reshaping its contours with a purpose that blurred the line between engineering, art, and worship. They understood the earth as a living, breathing entity, and their greatest works were acts of conversation with its spirit. This holistic vision reveals them not just as master builders, but as geopoets, writing their cosmology into the very soil and stone. The most staggering example is the transformation of San Lorenzo. The natural plateau was not enough. They expanded it into a vast, artificial acropolis, moving millions of cubic feet of earth. This was not merely to create a level space or a defensible position. By raising their ceremonial core high above the floodplain, they were creating a symbolic axis mundi, a place that was not of the ordinary world. It was an island of sacred order lifted from the chaotic, watery realm below, mirroring the primordial mound of creation from which the world was born. The earth they moved was not inert dirt. It was the flesh of the earth monster, sculpted into a new form to channel divine power. At La Venta, this dialogue became even more intricate. The entire site is a microcosm. The Great Pyramid is the sacred mountain. The long north-south plaza is the celestial plain. But beneath this, they performed their most intimate acts of communion. The buried offerings, the exquisite mosaics of serpentine blocks laid in the shape of a jaguar mask, the deposits of polished celts arranged in patterns, were not meant for human eyes. They were gifts inserted directly into the body of the earth. By sealing these precious objects in carefully layered, colored clays, they were quite literally feeding the land, planting seeds of spiritual energy into the ground to ensure its continued fertility and balance. They were plugging their sacred energy directly into the telluric current. This concept extended to their use of stone. The basalt for the colossal heads came from the Tuxtla Mountains, the distant, volcanic homes of powerful gods. Transporting a head 60 miles was not just a logistical feat. It was a ritual journey, a bringing of the mountain's essence to the ceremonial center. The head, once carved, became a permanent ambassador of that mountain power, anchored in the heart of the city. Similarly, the greenstone celts, shaped like maize kernels or lightning bolts, were more than symbols. When offered in caches, They were conceived of as literal seeds of fertility or bolts of divine energy planted to stimulate the Earth's productivity. Even their settlements followed this logic. They lived in a land of constant interaction between water and earth. Their raised fields, called chinampas in later times, were not just practical farming plots. They were extensions of this living earth body, artificially created zones of intense fertility where the elements mingled. Canals were not just for transport. They were veins circulating the lifeblood of water through the community's body. The sacred spring at El Manati was a direct orifice to the underworld, a place where the earth literally breathed forth water, and thus required the most precious offerings to maintain its flow. This worldview makes their decline a spiritual ecology as much as a physical one. When the climate shifted and the land began to fail, when the springs dried or flooded unpredictably, when the soil would no longer yield, it was not just an environmental crisis. It was a breakdown in the dialogue. The earth was no longer accepting their offerings or responding to their nurturing acts. The living landscape had become sick, or worse, silent. Their geometric order, their buried prayers, their monumental anchors could no longer stabilize the relationship. The decision to leave may have been, in their understanding, a necessary retreat from a relationship that had become broken and toxic. They were not abandoning a place. They were leaving a conversation that could no longer be sustained, allowing the land to fall back into its own wild silence. In this light, the sinking heads and the enveloping jungle are not a tragedy, but the earth slowly reclaiming the gifts and the symbols, absorbing them back into its own dreaming body. Within the quiet halls of academia and the lively pages of archaeological journals, a fundamental question about the Olmecs continues to generate thoughtful, sometimes heated discussion. It is a debate about origins and influence, framed by a powerful metaphor. Were the Olmecs the mother, or merely a sister? The mother culture theory, which this narrative has followed, argues that the Olmecs were the fount, the singular source from which the core ideas of Mesoamerican civilization first flowed. The opposing view, the sister culture theory, posits that the Olmecs were simply one of several brilliant contemporary cultures that developed in parallel, influencing each other as equals. This is not a petty argument over labels. It is a crucial inquiry into how civilization itself sparks and spreads. The case for the mother culture is built on a foundation of stone and time. The evidence of antiquity is overwhelming. San Lorenzo was a thriving, monumental city by 1200 BC, centuries before the rise of the Maya in the lowlands, the Zapotecs at Monte Alban, or the grand metropolis of Teotihuacan. This is not a matter of slight precedence. It is a head start of half a millennium or more. The artifacts also tell a story of primacy. The Olmecs created the first monumental sculpture, the first large-scale ceremonial plans, the first use of jade in a profoundly symbolic manner, and the earliest examples of the long count calendar and potential writing. These are not just isolated traits. They form a coherent, sophisticated package, a blueprint. Furthermore, the distribution of this package is telling. Pure Olmec motifs and objects are found scattered like seeds far from the heartland, at sites like Chalcatzingo and in the Soconusco region, often in the earliest layers. It looks less like a dialogue among equals and more like the export of a prestigious, finished product to places that had not yet developed their own complex iconography. The sister culture proponents, however, urge caution. They point out that the Olmec heartland was not an isolated laboratory. Throughout Mesoamerica, other regions were also undergoing the transition to complexity in the same general epoch. In the valley of Oaxaca, early Zapotec centers were forming. In the Maya highlands, sophisticated societies were emerging. The sister culture theory argues that these regions were not passive recipients, but active innovators. They suggest that the Olmecs may have been the most visually striking and perhaps the best connected traders, but not the sole inventors. Perhaps the idea of kingship, the ballgame, or certain religious concepts arose in multiple places through shared, underlying patterns of human development, a process anthropologists call parallel evolution. The Olmecs, in this view, were simply the most successful at broadcasting their particular style, making them appear as the source when they were just the loudest voice in a crowded, creative room. Modern research is, as it often does, pushing beyond this binary. The emerging picture is one of a complex foundation network. The Olmec heartland, with its staggering early achievements, was undoubtedly the first and most powerful node in this network. It was the initial spark, the primary innovator of that core package of civilization. However, the other regions, the Oaxacans, the early Maya, the peoples of the Central Highlands, were not blank slates. They had their own long histories and innovations. When they encountered Olmec ideas through trade or contact, they did not just copy them. They adapted, hybridized, and transformed them. They took the Olmec seed and grew their own unique species of civilization from it. Thus, the metaphor may need updating. The Olmecs were less a mother who gave birth to identical children, and more a master composer who wrote the first groundbreaking movement of a symphony. They established the key themes, the major motifs, the underlying structure, the sacred mountain, the divine king, the calendar, the ballgame. The cultures that followed were like brilliant subsequent composers, the Zapotec, the Maya, the Teotihuacanos, who took those themes and elaborated on them, creating their own variations, harmonies, and movements, resulting in a richer, more diverse masterpiece than any single culture could have produced alone. Their primacy is undeniable, but their legacy is not one of cloning, but of inspiration. They provided the foundational vocabulary, and all of Mesoamerica began to speak with it, creating a dazzling, millennia-long conversation in stone and blood that began with the silent, colossal faces in the Gulf Coast jungles. To walk through an Olmec gallery in a museum is to be surrounded by a silent cacophony of expression. The sleek, heavy stillness of a basalt head contrasts with the tense, dynamic pose of a stone wrestler. The delicate, sorrowful face of a jade were-jaguar pendant seems to hold a different emotion than the stern, inscrutable gaze of a pottery figurine. This is not random artistry. Every curve, every symbol, every material was a deliberate word in a complex visual language. Interpreting Olmec art is the work of decrypting a code where the key is lost, relying on comparison, context, and a deep understanding of the worldview that birthed it. It is an act of listening to what the stones are trying to say. The first principle of this language is material. The stone itself held meaning. Basalt from the distant volcanic mountains was the stone of permanence and earthly power, used for the eternal portraits of rulers and the altars that anchored them to the earth. Jade, with its translucent, life-giving green hue and incredible toughness, was the stone of essence, of breath and vitality, reserved for objects closest to the body and the spirit, pectorals, ear spools, and ritual cells. Serpentine, often used for mirrors and offerings, may have represented water or the surface of the sky. The choice of material was the first sentence of the object's story. Then comes the iconography, a set of recurring symbols that form a core vocabulary. The most potent is the caterfoil, a four-lobed shape that looks like a cross within a circle. This is not a decoration, it is a map. It represents the entrance to the underworld, a cave or a portal often shown as the mouth of the earth monster. When a ruler is depicted seated within a caterfoil, the art declares, "This king emerges from the sacred womb of the earth." The bar and four dots motif is another profound symbol. It likely represents a bundle, perhaps a sacred bundle of royal regalia or maize, a concept central to later Mesoamerican kingship. It signifies office, authority, and the compact between the ruler and the source of power. The imagery of transformation is everywhere, speaking to the fluid nature of reality. The were-jaguar is the ultimate symbol of this. Human and beast, infant and predator, life-giver and life-taker. But look closer at other figures. Many human representations have subtly almond-shaped, slitted eyes, a hint of the jaguar within. Birds merge with serpents to become the feathered serpent. This art proclaims that boundaries between states of being are illusions. Everything is capable of becoming something else, and the shaman king is the master of this metamorphosis. The poses and contexts are also grammatical. A figure with a hand placed on the chest often denotes authority or self-reference. A figure with an upturned head and parted lips is in a state of ecstatic trance, perhaps singing a sacred chant or communing with an ancestor. The colossal heads are a grammar of power in themselves. Frontality, facing directly forward, and symmetry convey immovable authority and balance. They are not engaged with the viewer. They transcend interaction, existing as eternal watching presences. Yet, for all we can decipher, profound mysteries remain in the art. What is the specific narrative behind the tableau at Chalcatzingo, with its ruler in the cave and the rain clouds above? Is it a specific myth, a coronation, a historical event? The meaning of many abstract signs incised on pottery and celts is lost. The expressions on the figurines, often described as sad, serene, or stern, may convey emotional states we can no longer fully comprehend, tied to specific rituals or social roles. Interpreting this art is therefore an act of humility. We can learn the vocabulary, jaguar, cave, cleft, serpent, mirror, and understand the general grammar of power and transformation. We can see how this visual language was adopted and adapted by later cultures, proving its potency. But the full poems, the specific stories and names, are in a tongue we can only partially sound out. The stones speak, but in a dialect where some key phrases are murmured too softly for us to hear, leaving us to ponder the gaps, and in doing so, to feel the vast, intelligent presence of the minds that first gave them voice. This artistic legacy, this coded worldview, was their most enduring export, carried not by armies, but by the sheer compelling power of image and symbol into the minds of all who saw it. Each colossal head is an island of selfhood carved in stone. To stand before one is not to see a generic idol, but to meet the specific, weathered gaze of an individual who lived and breathed over 3,000 years ago. The sheer, overwhelming mass of the sculpture screams of power, but the careful, particularized features whisper of personality. These are portraits, and in their creation, the Olmecs performed a revolutionary act. They fused the immortal essence of kingship with the mortal details of a man's face, creating a new, enduring concept of political identity. The weight of the helmet they wear is more than physical. It is the weight of an entire cosmological system resting on a single human brow. The individuality is undeniable. Archaeologists have noted clear distinctions. Head 1 from San Lorenzo has a wide, open face with full cheeks. Head 5 from the same site wears a grim, determined expression with a furrowed brow and tighter lips. The heads from La Venta have a more refined, introspective quality, with downcast eyes and thinner features. These differences are too deliberate to be artistic variation. They record the unique visages of specific rulers, likely commemorating them upon their death or at the climax of their reign. In a world without written history as we know it, these heads were the history books, a stone lineage lining the sacred plazas. The helmet is the key to unlocking the sculpture's meaning. It is not military headgear, but the protective padding of the ball player. This single detail ties the ruler directly to the most sacred and politically charged ritual in Olmec life. By depicting the king eternally ready for the ball game, the sculpture declares that his rule was not passive, but an active, athletic engagement in the cosmic struggle. He was not just a priest who prayed for balance. He was a combatant who fought for it in the ritual arena. The game was a metaphor for his perpetual battle against chaos, and his helmet was the armor for that eternal war. The deep, horizontal band across the forehead of many helmets may represent a strap, but it also visually severs the head, echoing the decapitation sacrifice linked to the game, symbolizing the king's ultimate willingness to offer himself for the world's renewal. The act of creating the head was as important as the finished object. The labor itself, quarrying the basalt boulder from the Tuxtla Mountains, floating it down rivers, dragging it overland, and the years of carving by master craftsmen, was a continuous communal act of allegiance. Every citizen who hauled a rope or gave food to the workers was participating in the creation of the king's eternal presence. The head's physical immensity made the abstract idea of his authority tangible and unignorable. It was power made geography. But then we must confront their burial. At San Lorenzo, these sacred portraits of divine kings were defaced and interred in long, neat rows. This was not disrespect. It was ritual retirement. Perhaps when a dynasty fell or a new order emerged, the old powers had to be carefully neutralized and put to rest, their energy safely returned to the earth. At La Venta, some heads were buried respectfully, perhaps as part of ancestor veneration. This cycle from triumphant display to sacred interment mirrors the Olmec view of existence itself. Everything emerges from the earth, has its season of power, and then returns to it. The king, for all his divinity, was not exempt from this cycle. His stone head, like the maize plant, would eventually be harvested and placed back in the soil of time. Thus, the colossal head is the ultimate Olmec paradox. It is a celebration of a unique individual, yet it subsumes him into an eternal archetypal role. It is a symbol of supreme, unchallengeable power, yet it acknowledges the inevitability of that power's end and its return to the earth. It is a portrait of a man, but it is addressed to the gods, the ancestors, and the people, declaring a contract between them all. When we look into the weathered stone eyes today, we are not just seeing a face. We are witnessing the invention of the state, the sacralization of leadership, and the breathtaking ambition to make a single human identity bear the weight of the entire world, and to make that weight last for eternity. In the dappled shadows of the Olmec rainforest, the jaguar moved as a ripple of contained thunder. Its power was absolute, a fact of life woven into the very fabric of the world. To the Olmecs, this creature was more than an animal. It was a fundamental cosmic principle made flesh, a living paradox that embodied the two most vital, terrifying, and inseparable forces, life and death. The jaguar was not a god to be worshipped from afar, but a raw, existential truth to be understood, channeled, and ultimately merged with. This profound duality is the heartbeat of Olmec spirituality, and it pulses through every aspect of their culture. On one paw, the jaguar was the ultimate life-giver. It was the lord of rain and fertility. Its domain was the night, and the night brought the life-giving dew and the nourishing rains. Its growl was the thunder that shook the sky, cracking it open to release the water that filled rivers and made maize grow. The were-jaguar infant with its crying face is this aspect, the storm that brings the blessing of water. The jaguar's association with caves, the dark, moist wombs of the earth from which springs emerged and maize first sprouted, further tied it to creation and fertility. A ruler claiming kinship with the jaguar was not just claiming brute force. He was claiming the authority to summon the rains, to ensure the earth's bounty. He was the cultivator, the nourisher. On the other paw, the jaguar was the avatar of death and the underworld. It was the most efficient predator, a master of the sudden, violent end. It hunted in the darkness, the realm of ancestors and spirits. Its strength was terrifying and final. This aspect connected the jaguar to warfare, sacrifice, and the inevitable return of all living things to the earth. The jaguar's fangs in the were-jaguar motif are not just decorative. They are a promise of this transformative violence. The predator's kill was not seen as a meaningless end, but as a necessary transfer of energy, a returning of life force to the cosmic cycle to fuel new creation. The ballgame, with its potential for ritual decapitation, was played in the jaguar's shadow. The losing player, sacrificed, became a jaguar's offering to the gods. The shaman king existed at the knife edge of this duality. His role was to balance these forces. Through bloodletting rituals, he drew on the jaguar's deadly aspect, spilling his own sacred blood, a symbolic self-sacrifice to feed the gods. But this act was meant to trigger the jaguar's life-giving aspect to bring the rain. He wore jaguar pelts and embodied the creature's power in ceremonies. He may have even entered trance states, seeking to transform his consciousness to see with jaguar eyes and travel the spirit realm. He did not seek to conquer the jaguar's nature, but to integrate it, to become the point where life and death, destruction and fertility met and were held in a tense, productive equilibrium. This duality explains the pervasive, haunting emotion in Olmec art. The were-jaguar infant is not smiling, it weeps or snarls. The colossal heads are not triumphant, they are solemn, burdened with knowledge. This is the expression of a culture that stared unflinchingly at the central truth of existence, that life is precious precisely because it is sustained by death. The maize seed must be buried, die, to sprout live. The rainstorm that waters the fields can also wash them away. The king who ensures life must be prepared to deal death, even upon himself. The Olmecs did not create a sunny, benevolent pantheon. They recognized the universe as a dynamic, often fearsome system of exchange. The jaguar was their perfect symbol for this system: beautiful, powerful, nurturing, and lethal. By embracing this duality wholeheartedly, they built a civilization that was resilient, profound, and deeply honest about the cost of existence. Their legacy is not one of simple peace or brutal war, but of a sophisticated, unblinking acceptance of the fundamental twin forces that govern all things, and the sacred, terrible duty of those who would stand between them. The story of the Olmecs does not end with the vines shrouding La Venta. It flows like an underground river through the limestone bedrock of the Yucatan Peninsula, emerging centuries later in the dazzling brilliance of the Maya civilization. The connection is not one of vague influence, but of direct, tangible inheritance, a passing of the torch in a relay race across time. To witness classic Maya culture at its height is to see the Olmec seed not only sprouted, but grown into a magnificent, complex forest. The Maya were not mere copyists. They were brilliant scholars who took the Olmec curriculum and wrote their own profound, elaborate commentaries in the margins. The most undeniable line of descent is in the calendar. The Maya are famed for their obsessive tracking of time, but the engine of their system, the long count, was an Olmec invention. The very concept of counting days from a mythic starting point, of plotting human and divine events on a vast linear timeline, originated in the Olmec heartland. The Maya perfected it, creating interlocking cycles of incredible complexity, but the foundational principle, the idea of time as a sacred, measurable substance, was an Olmec gift. The Maya Day Zero may even reference an Olmec creation event, a memory of the first dawn as understood by the makers of the colossal heads. Kingship follows the same path. The Olmec shaman king, the mediator between worlds who performed bloodletting rituals and embodied the jaguar's power, is the direct ancestor of the Maya Kayuhul-Ajo, the Holy Lord. The elaborate Maya accession rituals, where rulers grasped a ceremonial bar, echoing the Olmec bar and four dots symbol, and donned headdresses of jade and quetzal feathers, are evolved versions of Olmec iconography of power. The Maya stela, a tall stone slab carved with a king's image and hieroglyphic text, is the logical evolution of the Olmec colossal head and altar. Both are stone proclamations of divine authority, though the Maya added the biography and the specific date. The ballgame is another direct heirloom. The Olmecs provided the core package: the rubber ball, the protective gear, the ritual court, and the deep association with sacrifice and cosmic renewal. The Maya built spectacular stone ball courts like the Great Court at Copan, and wove the game into their epic mythology of the hero twins in the Popol Vuh. The Olmec were jaguar, a symbol of stormy power, finds its clear descendants in Maya deities like the reptilian rain god Chak, who wields lightning axes, and in the underworld jaguar gods of the night sun. The Olmec feathered serpent slithers directly into the Maya pantheon as Kukulkan. Even trade routes became cultural highways. The paths first blazed by Olmec traders seeking Guatemalan jade became the established routes through which Maya merchants, centuries later, moved goods and ideas. The early Maya site of Caminal-Juyu in the Guatemalan highlands shows strong Olmec influence in its earliest phases, as if the local elite first learned how to be kings by studying Olmec manuals. The transition is visible in the archaeological record at places like the site of Izapa on the Pacific coast. Here, art styles exist in a fascinating blend. There are clear Olmec motifs, stylized were-jaguar faces, flame brows, but they begin to be arranged in more narrative scenes on stelae that look forward to classic Maya monuments. Izapa appears to be a workshop where the Olmec raw material was being actively reworked into a new form. It was a bridge. Thus, the Maya did not arise independently. They were the Olmecs' most attentive students. They took the foundational toolkit, the calendar, the concept of divine kingship, the ballgame, the iconographic vocabulary, the reverence for jade and sacred landscape, and applied their own genius for mathematics, astronomy, and hieroglyphic writing to it. They expanded the conversation, but they were speaking in a language first coined in the heartland. The Olmec voice did not fade. It was amplified, given grammar and syntax, and projected across centuries. When a Maya king drew a stingray spine through his tongue to conjure a vision serpent, he was performing an act whose spiritual logic was perfected long before, in the humid plazas of San Lorenzo. The echo in the cenote is deep, clear, and undeniable. The truth about the Olmecs, as uncovered by decades of meticulous archaeology, is staggering enough. A civilization of pioneers who carved 20-ton portraits and invented the sacred calendars of an entire continent. Yet for some, this reality is not enough. In the shadowy space between fact and fantasy, the Olmecs have been reborn as protagonists in a very different kind of story. They have been claimed by pseudo-archaeology and woven into modern myths that speak more to our own desires and anxieties than to the ancient past. This journey into fringe theories is not just a detour. It is a reflection of how a civilization shrouded in mystery becomes a screen onto which we project our own questions about identity, origins, and lost glory. The most persistent myth is that of the trans-oceanic voyager. Since Jose Melgar's first report in 1862 noted the African features of the colossal head, a narrative has flourished that the Olmecs could not possibly be Native American. They have been cast as lost Egyptians, Nubians, Phoenicians, or even refugees from the sunken continent of Atlantis. These theories, often underpinned by outdated racial ideologies, ignore the overwhelming evidence of in situ development. They cherry-pick superficial resemblances, like the head's broad nose, while dismissing the entirety of Native American cultural achievement. The purpose is often to deny the capacity of indigenous Americans to create such a culture independently, instead inserting an old world, civilizing force. It is a myth of displacement. Another popular thread ties the Olmecs to legendary beings. Their monumental scale has inspired tales of a race of giants who built the cities, a story found in some local folklore. More recently, in the era of ancient astronaut theories, the Olmecs have been recruited as evidence of extraterrestrial contact. The were-jaguar's unusual features are said to represent alien visitors or genetic experiments. The sheer weight of the basalt heads is cited as proof of impossible technology. These stories strip the Olmecs of their humanity and genius, transforming their profound spiritual and engineering accomplishments into the side effects of outside intervention. It is a myth of disempowerment, suggesting humans are incapable of such wonders on their own. Why do these myths persist when the academic truth is so compelling? First, the Olmecs are a perfect blank slate. Their real language is unreadable, their history vague, their origins still partly obscure. This ambiguity invites speculation. Second, their achievements feel impossible. The image of moving a 24-ton stone head through a swamp without wheels or draft animals triggers a cognitive dissonance that some resolve with stories of superhuman aid. Third, these myths fulfill a romantic need for connection to a more mysterious, more advanced, or more globally interconnected ancient world. Engaging with these modern myths is important, not to endorse them, but to understand their appeal and to clarify what archaeology actually reveals. Science shows the Olmecs developed from earlier archaic populations in the region. Their art style evolved from simpler forms. Their jade sources have been located in the Americas. Their calendrical systems show a step-by-step development. There is no material evidence, no Phoenician coins, no Egyptian papyrus, no alien alloy to support external contact. The true story is one of indigenous innovation, a human story of trial, error, and breathtaking creativity in response to a specific environment. The Olmecs, in the end, are victims of their own magnificence. Their works are so grand that for some, only grander, more magical explanations will suffice. But in doing so, these myths miss the real magic, that ordinary humans with stone tools and profound belief managed to alter the landscape of history forever. The pseudo-archaeological Olmec is a fantastical phantom. The real Olmecs, the mothers and fathers of Mesoamerican civilization, are a testament to the boundless potential of the human mind right here on Earth, a truth more astonishing than any fiction.